final portion of the show, we come to the affectionately dubbed Chit Chat, named, in case it wasn't clear last week, for chits, which are cardboard punch-outs that come with board games. They're a very common element. They come in various shapes and sizes. They can denote wound markers, such as these and these. They can show you points. They can be money. They can be the units you fight with, or the upgrades to your spaceships. They do all sorts of functions. They're a very integral part of board gaming, and well, we just like the sound of it. So,
you know, I'm always in for a good pun. Today we're going to be talking about the differences between asymmetrical and symmetrical games and gameplay. Mm-hmm. It is a common term bandied about in talks about game design, and it's one of the more fundamental aspects of any given game.
Mm-hmm. So we brought out a few examples here for you guys to relate to. For symmetrical games, these are games where every player starts out with the same resources, equal access to resources, and sort of the same starting positions. Everyone starts off with equal footing. The only difference usually is who goes first. Other than that, people have access to the same abilities. They have access to the same mechanics. You're trying to win through the same exact goals and means. There's no sort of variable player abilities.
However, in an asymmetrical game, you may not necessarily have all of that. There are certainly, though it's not to say that an asymmetrical game is either all, games aren't either all one way or all the other, but certainly, although not all games have you starting with the exact same base either. Asymmetrical games typically feature different starting points for different characters. Maybe each different player controls a different faction that has different sorts of abilities. Maybe different players have different mechanics to work with. They'll often still be working toward the same goal, but they often have very different ways to go about it. Different players will then, it makes sense for them to employ very different strategies.
And in some games you have even different goals.
Yeah, some games like Last Night on Earth, which we don't have here, but is a game where where the groups essentially fighting each other, but one group wins when a timer runs out, and the other group wins when they succeeded a certain goal. Mm-hmm. That is a very asymmetrical game.
Yeah, and you have that comes up too in scenarios for Tannhauser or for Memoir 44. It's a very common sort of war game feature. So yeah, you have objectives that both teams are trying to complete that are very different. One team might be trying to capture a certain outpost. Another team might be trying to get a certain bit of information. So it really varies from game to game.
We have some examples out ahead of us here of some games that we see a lot of play of that have very symmetrical or very asymmetrical qualities to them. You want to get started with it?
Yeah, so Lost Cities, a game by the very prolific designer Rainer Knizia. This game is pretty straightforward. Both players are trying to explore the various areas of the world, and there is a common deck that both players draw from, which has different values. But the important thing here is that both players draw from a single deck, and they are both trying to compete for the same locations.
Whereas there's, I'll start with Yomi since we've already looked at it. A game like Yomi has a lot of asymmetrical qualities. It has all the different decks in it have necessarily different cards in them, different ways to play, different distributions of the different kinds of cards they have in the deck. It is a game that, for each different player, encourages a very different style of play.
Mm-hmm. Cave Troll, on the other hand, a personal favorite of mine, a game by Tom Jolly. Cave Troll, every player has a separate deck, but all the decks are identical. So players will have access to different abilities at different times, but over the course of the whole game, most players will see most of the same abilities. You're trying to control different regions of the map here and sort of get gold off of them by scoring those particular rooms. So it's a nice area control game. There's a lot of symmetry in the way players take turns, and everyone has an equal deck that never changes over the course of the game.
In a game like Pocket Battles, though, you have it's a more asymmetrical game wherein both players will have the same goal in mind of beating the other group. But this game has a very asymmetrical quality to it because each team is given a pool of tiles to use, a pool of these are the chits that are used in the game. and each faction has different sets of tiles, and you use those to you essentially draw up a pool of them, use those as your army, and beyond just the factions being different, each player's choice of starting army is different, which further adds a level of complexity to it.
Much like a lot of war games or a lot of miniature games, you spend a certain number of points to build your army. So so like you said, there's a lot of variability in that. Another favorite of mine. On the symmetrical side, we have the ever popular Settlers of Catan. Probably familiar with Settlers. It's a game wherein you place settlements and cities and try to collect resources, which you can trade with other players. You spend these resources to build armies, construct roads, build more and more settlements and cities until somebody has enough victory points to win. With this game, you all start out with the same opportunities, although this game actually becomes, I would say, slightly asymmetrical. This goes back to your distinction of, sort of not all or nothing. It's a little more asymmetrical than the other two because you have different starting positions. So who goes first in Settlers actually matters quite a bit. And you can get a huge advantage by getting certain starting locations, and that can really determine how your game goes. If you get a lot of grain and ore, you can quickly build cities, and you can focus on sort of just farming more and more of those things. If you get another set of resources, you can work on just building up your army by getting victory cards. So this has a little more asymmetrical quality, but again, you all have the same access at the beginning, and you're all pulling from the same deck of resources and the same deck of victory cards. So I would say more symmetrical than none.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Despite, there is the occasional game that leads to there are lots of games of Settlers end up being, as I fondly term it, all brick all the time games, wherein one player has all the brick. There was a very notable game we played recently where one of the players had, I think, every log card in the game. To
be fair, it does have a mechanic for that with the robber.
Right.
But it's sort of, it's very luck-based. Settlers in general is very luck-based, so.
And finally, on the asymmetrical side, we have a very notable example of this in Tannhäuser, a game that it's a team game. There's 2 teams in it, and each team has a different set of playable characters. Like each team has 5 characters on it. So already the teams are asymmetrical. But beyond that, the individual characters themselves are very different. So if you have a group that is more than 2 people, each individual player controls a different guy than even the other people on their team. There's a little asymmetry even within the teams in this one.
Oh, and you can equip yourself with different things too.
Right, and
so
you can
even
equip,
there's a loadout, sort of like Call of Duty style.
Right. So again, a game similar to Pocket Battles where you can decide how to build your character.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we like all these games really. I think with symmetrical games, there are a lot of advantages for both. With symmetrical games, you tend to have there's something nice about going into it with no sort of potential advantages. If I sit down to play Pocket Battles with a new player, it is likely that I'm going to be starting off with not only the advantage of experience, but the advantage of having a better constructed army. It's hard to know what you want to put in your army and how you want to build squads unless you know how to play already. So it kind of furthers the divide between a skilled player and a new player because they have to make decisions before they've even gotten into the game.
Right, which can be seen as an advantage toward the more symmetrical games, and a lot of games that people think of classically, games like chess, checkers, things like that. I would say a lot of abstract strategy games in general.
Almost all abstract I would say are symmetrical.
But it's very much the games tend to be a little more symbolic. I would say a lot of it is like everybody's the same pool of resources, and you're just how you manipulate those.
Mm-hmm. And we mentioned last week that Euro games tend more toward symmetry. American games tend more toward asymmetry. I think that's just part of the sort of the way they play out. I think there are certain. I think part of the reason that you end up fighting for these resource pools more with symmetrical games is in part because they're more Euro games. You do have symmetrical games that are war games, like chess, for instance. And so, I think there's not necessarily. I wouldn't say that either type is favored by certain games, if that makes any sense. I would say that if you want to build a war game, you could build it symmetrical, you could build it asymmetrical. It's more common to do a war game asymmetrically, but I don't think you have to. I don't think any one game has to be a certain one of the two.
Absolutely, but there are also certain common tricks that are used too. Like if you're going to build a game that is asymmetrical, a common thing that you see is factions more or less. Like you see that in Pocket Battles, you see that in Tannhäuser. You see not really faction choice, but character choice in Yomi. It's a very common way to go about that is to have the players when they start the game pick a different person or faction to play as.
And asymmetry gives you two advantages there because not only can you tailor your game to your play style. If I'm a conservative player, so I tend to not want a character that involves a lot of risks. Want a character that wants to draw the game out, make my move when I want to make it, and I can do that with an asymmetrical game. I can choose that kind of character. In addition, that game tend to have a little bit more feel to it, a little more theme, because you can sort of get into the heads of the characters. If I play Yomi, I kind of imagine that I know what some of the characters' personalities are like.
Right, and Yomi certainly with its theme and contributes to that. I mean, I have to plug this guy again. If I can plug DeGray for a second time in 2 weeks, like I mentioned last time, he has a constitution on his cards. Just it doesn't have any impact on the cards themselves, but you do get more of a sense of almost of world that the game is in.
And yeah, I think you definitely get a feel for the kind of character that DeGray is for sure. What else? That's symmetrical. Like I said, I don't think there's a certain advantage to doing it one way or the other. I think it just gives you access to a different set of options. If you're building a game, you have to decide kind of from the outset if it's going to be symmetrical or asymmetrical.
Right, as opposed to you don't decide when you're making a game whether it's going to be American or European per se, but you do decide whether it's going to be symmetrical or asymmetrical rather quickly.
And to give one more bit of credit to symmetrical games, they can still employ vastly different strategies even with the same starting points. A game like Dominion, very popular game, you're building a deck over the course of the game, and you're trying to load it up with point cards, and at the end, whoever has the most points in their decks wins. Now, you all start out with the same 10 cards in your deck, and you all have access to the same pool of 10 cards to purchase. So you all start at the same point, but in good games of Dominion, not all, in some games you still have, unfortunately, a regression to, there's just too many good power cards, and, 2 players or 3 players go for the same ones. And that happens. But when you get lucky, if you get a good game of Dominion, you'll have players going for vastly different strategies. One guy will be trying to make his deck as thin and sleek as possible, trying to load it up with high value gold cards and just hit them consistently. Another player will be loading it up with action cards and taking an almost Gosu-like solitaire turn, just really going to town, playing a bunch of actions, getting a bunch of stuff all at once.
Right, and another game we had seen some play of, Primordial Soup, is the same way. It's a game where everybody starts out in more or less the same position, and it has a lot of very symmetric tendencies, but at the same time, it is a game that lends itself to very different strategies. And
it's sort of a hybrid, I would say, actually. You start out in a symmetrical position, but then that changes.
Yeah, because there's so much the game involves changing your setup, changing the way your essentially your team works. It is a game that it does kind of buck the trend too of having the buck the theming trend. It is a game that starts out very symmetrical that has a very, very clear and rather distinct theme.
So yeah, I'd say in closing, there are advantages and disadvantages to both types. And if you're looking at a game, it should be pretty obvious which one it is or what elements are symmetrical versus asymmetrical. So we hope you enjoyed our chit chat today.